Good morning. We're studying Hebrews. If you're joining us online, we'll be predominantly in chapter 6 and 7 today. We're going to tread into some deep water today. So let's draw a straight line between where we were to where we are today. You remember in Hebrews chapter 5. In Hebrews chapter 5, he was discussing Melchizedek. And we talked a little bit about him. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time rehearsing those things. But you remember in verse 11 of chapter 5, he said, of whom we have much to say, it's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. And what he meant by that was you're intemperate. You have no ambition for the word. You don't wish to grow. You're stagnant. You're immature. And so that's the condition of those individuals. And then you remember he said, if you keep that up, you're going to fall away. And it's going to be nigh unto impossible to restore you. And we talked a little bit about Melchizedek. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him today, specifically with reference to, well, you'll see as we go on. But you know, the writer of the book of Hebrews wanted them to go on to what he referred to as perfection. And he said, if you continue going in this course, you're going to fall away. That's the bottom line there. So this thing is messing me up, so we won't use it. All right. So let's talk about Hebrews chapter 6 today. Let me read for you just a few things. He said, but beloved, we are confident of better things concerning you. Yes, things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner, for God is not unjust to forget your works and your labor of love, which you have shown towards his name. He says, in that you have ministered to the saints and you do minister. They're not worthless. They're not beyond repair. He said, you've got a good start. You need to press on and finish this course. And he said, we desire that each one of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end, that you do not become sluggish. You do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience, inherit the promises. Now that kind of language in the mind of a Hebrew Christian brings to recollection who? Faith through patience to achieve the inheritance. Who's that sound like? You're right, it sounds like Abraham. And that's where he's going with this. So let's read a little further and then we'll get into the meat of the passage here. He said, but beloved, we're confident of better things concerning you. Things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner. As you go on and you look at the remainder of the book, he's priming the pump for them. He's telling them there's something that I want to tell you about that I want you in recollection of it as Hebrew Christians. He says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, father of the nation, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. That's recounting Genesis in the 22nd chapter, which we will come to in just a moment. But notice the terminology used here. He could swear by no one greater. So he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, Abraham, he obtained the promise. Now listen, for men indeed swear by the greater. I don't really want to talk about swearing today, but there is this misconception that swearing was not an acceptable practice. It is acceptable in certain conditions, depending upon how you view it, but under Judaism, they were, in the book of Leviticus, required to make their oaths before God, to swear before God. But the thought behind that was, Whatever it is that you are agreeing to, it's as though you did it in my presence. And in fact, Leviticus says, bring your oaths before me. So when he's talking about this oath, this swearing, it has a certain significance, biblical significance. Let me show you what I'm talking about. After he had patiently endured, he attained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is to them an end of all disputes. This is in generic terms, in the sense of men dealing with other men. And he said, if you swear, that's an end to disputation. If you say, yes, I agree, and you confirm it with a sworn oath, in the public sphere, that would be the end of the argument. In other words, if you're going to buy my house, we sign an agreement. That is, in essence, an oath. It means that I agree to buy your house, you buy my house, whatever it is that we're agreeing to. It's an end to disputation. These are the terms of our agreement. Not so uncommon in those days. But look what he says now. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, what are those two immutable things he's referring to? His promise, he made a promise. And he confirmed that by an oath. He swore. What is an oath? What is a swearing?
With God, it's his word. His word stands forever, whatever he said. And he will not change it. He can change his attitude.
Well,
But he can't change his word.
it's an agreement, is it not? It's an unchangeable agreement. And so it is that by two immutable things, by God's promise, he made a promise, and then he swore by it. A promise that he swore by. It's impossible for God to lie. We might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold on the hope set before us. Now, consider the importance of this promise. And you know what the promise is. We're talking about the promise to Abraham. Let's look at these particular passages because God reiterates them through the book of Genesis in particular to Abraham, constantly reminding him through his life, particularly at eventful circumstances. Let me show you what I mean. In Genesis 12, he makes the original promise. You know what the promise is. What is that promise? You've got a threefold promise. What is that? Land. And the land is what? Canaan. What else? Nation. And the nation is? And what else is there? The seed. And the seed is? It's Christ, and ultimately us through him. That through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And that's what he promised beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis. He said, go from your country to the kindred, and from your father's house to the land I will show you, and I'll make a great nation of you. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And then he said in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis, he said, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make thy covenant. A covenant is a what? It's an agreement, right? It's an oath. It's the same term. And in chapter 15, he tells them, behold, my covenant is with you. He says, you'll be the father of the multitude of nations. No longer shall you be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham, the father of the multitude of nations. He said, I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. I'll make of you a nation. Kings shall come from you. He said, I'll establish my covenant, my agreement my promise between me and you and your offspring. An everlasting covenant, he called it. And chapter 17, he said he brought him outside and said, look towards the heaven. You know this passage. It said, number of the stars, if you're able to number them. He's going to make of you a great nation, so shall your offspring be. And the Lord, and he believed the Lord, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And then the passage we are referring to now, we'll skip forward a little bit, but he reiterates that again, chapter 18. And then here in chapter 20 of the book of Genesis, listen to it. This is the passage he's alluding to. He said, the angel of the Lord called to Abram a second time from heaven, and he said, by myself I have sworn. This is the occasion he's referring to. It's the occasion of his offering his son Isaac. You remember that? Here's what he said about that. He said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. As Abraham goes through his life, he gets surety that his persistence and patience and faith is gaining for him a reward, a promised reward. Are you with me? All right. So, Hebrews 6 rounds it out with this statement. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul. We have a promise from God. All the way through Abraham, through Jesus, all the way to us. He said, we have a hope as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. It's immutable. It will never change. And which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus. Now, a little later, we're going to be talking about the tabernacle. This symbolism is exceedingly important. It was when he told Moses about the tabernacle. He said, for see, saith he, that thou makest all things according to the pattern that I showed to thee in the mount. There is a reason for that. This constant allusion to the Levitical order, to the tabernacle, to these inherently Jewish things are very important in the symbolism. He said, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, you remember in chapter 5 where we started, he said, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Melchizedek, but it's hard to understand and you're very dull of hearing. Now we come right back to Melchizedek because he has hopefully piqued their interest, caused them to take a personal inventory of what he's saying, and he thinks now we're ready to talk about Melchizedek. Are you ready? We're heading into deep water here. Here we go. We're at chapter 7. He said, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem. There is he translates this for them. He says, king of Salem. Your translation may say, king of peace. Presumptively, this is Jerusalem. There are other kings with their names being of a similar kind. I think it's Joshua 10. I may be wrong about this. I know it's in Joshua, but Joshua 10, there is a guy by the name of Adonai-Zedek, which means the Lord of peace, also a king of Jerusalem. What I'm trying to show you is that the significance of this name is what the writer is trying to emphasize. As Chad said last week, he is both king and a priest. Listen what he says. This Melchizedek, he is the king of Salem. He is a priest of the Most High God. He met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he blessed him. And Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He did not pay him a tithe. There were no tithes in the Levitical sense because Levi didn't exist. He gave him a tenth part. The Hebrew word there is ma'eser. Ma'eser. Eser is the word for 10 in Hebrew. And so what he gave him was a tenth part. By the way, that giving of a tenth part, at least in secular history, predates Israel by a long time. It's in ergot literature. It's in, what I'm saying is that Abraham came from an area where giving a tenth part was not an uncommon thing. You may not know that, but the actual Levitical system of tithing, if you want to put it that way, giving a tenth part, didn't exist until Moses, which is important here. All right? Why is that important? Because here's what he says. He says, to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything, of the spoils of the slaughter of the king. You don't tithe. There's a good reason you don't tithe. Number one, that is an exceedingly large amount of substance. Because you've got to remember there was a reason for Levitical tithing. You probably don't give on the order of a tithe if you want to. In other words, a tithe represented grain, seed, fruits, animals, a tenth of every part of wealth that they had. But that's because they're supporting a Levitical system. Priests didn't have private properties. You could have a private property, but it reverted back to the families that it came from every Jubilee year. And so they had no permanent wealth. They did not possess beyond what the nation provided the priesthood. And so from those tithes, poor people were taken care of. It's kind of a social security system. People who were needy, elderly people. And so that system would not be practical today. If you do give a tenth of whatever you have, you probably are giving a tremendous amount of money. We don't do that. And this New Testament doesn't ask us to do that. 1 Corinthians 16:2 says, what? Let each one of you lay by him in store, that there be no gatherings when I come. As you prosper. That's a determination made by the individual based on their own circumstance. 2 Corinthians says, God loves a cheerful giver. They didn't have an option under tithing. It was essentially a tax. However, Abraham, recognizing Melchizedek to be God's king and priest, gave him a tenth of the spoils. And here's what it says. It says, he is first, by translation, king of righteousness. That's what Melchizedek means, like we were talking about before. It comes from Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. It's a possessive, really. It means my king of righteousness. And then he's also a king of Salem, probably Jerusalem. It is a physical place. So he's both a king and a priest. He's a king of peace. That's what Salem means. He is without mother or father or genealogy, having neither beginning of days or end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. All right. That doesn't mean that Melchizedek wasn't born. It doesn't mean he didn't have a mother and a father. It didn't mean that he doesn't necessarily have a generation after him. It means what? Sure, we don't know those things. I'll go out on a limb and tell you this. Melchizedek was a man. He had a mom and a dad, and he was born, and he lived, and he died, and he had a family. More than likely, we don't have a record of it. And so for all intent and purpose, he always has been. figuratively. Melchizedek didn't pre-exist. He wasn't preeminent like Jesus is. But it does say, resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Melchizedek is dead and gone. That isn't the point of the discussion. The point of the discussion is that he is a forerunner. He is a shadow of what? Of Jesus, who literally pre-existed. And by the way, Jesus isn't in a line of priests of Melchizedek. There is only one Jesus, and he occupies only one office of priesthood. There's never been anybody like him, and there never will be another priest after him. He occupies a singularly unique office. That's the point of what he's trying to say. Why is that important? Well, then you got to go a little further in the book. He said, see how great this man, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of spoil. And those descendants of Levi, here's where you got to put your thinking cap on, because you may notice now that you're seeing contradistinctions between Melchizedek, between Jesus, and between Levi. If you lose track of this, you will lose track of the train of thought here. So here's what he says. This man, he's talking about Melchizedek, how great he was in that Abraham gave him a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a command in the law to take tithes from the people. That is, from their brothers. Listen to it again. They take tithes from the people. That is, from their brothers. They are like them. They're not better than them. They're not worse than them. They are them. They take tithes from their brothers, though these are also descended from Abraham. But Levi doesn't exist yet. Aaron doesn't exist yet. And so he's speaking figuratively with retrospection, and here's what he says. This man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had promises. Remember the promise? Abraham is the one who had the promises made. Melchizedek is the one he met, and Melchizedek blessed him. Why is that? It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So who's more important here? Abraham or Melchizedek? Melchizedek is. He's God's priest and king. Abraham is father of the nation. He's the one to whom a promise was made. Melchizedek is the one through whom that promise occurs. And here's what he says. He says, in the one case, tithes are received by mortal men. Who is that? The mortal men who receive tithes. Those are the Levitical priests. They don't exist yet. All right. In one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, what other case? By whom it is testified that he lives. It harkens back to Melchizedek again. And here's what he says. One might even say that Levi himself, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. They are all interconnected, is what he's showing you. There is a plan of God in place, such that Abraham received a promise. The promise extends to us. How does that happen? It happens because Melchizedek met Abraham, foreshadowed Jesus, who became our high priest, who has gone in beyond the veil into the presence of God. Are you with me? Do you have a comment, a question? Go ahead. Say it, brother.
Our faithfulness, like Abraham's, is considered righteousness.
That's true too. Good point. Let me show you something here. Now, if perfection had been attainable, here's the deep water. Listen to it, think about it, just think about it. It may be different than something you've heard before. It may be wrong to some degree, but let me put it to you this way. Watch this. If perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is a necessity of a change of the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one ever served at the altar. It's evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Now, you know what he's saying about the priesthood. He's saying Jesus did not come from Levi. He came from Judah, the kingly tribe, not Levi, the priestly tribe. And Moses never spoke of the tribe of Judah having a part at the altar. That was only for who? Right? That was only for Levi. Now, it said, now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what perfection? What is he referring to? I heard a couple of things here. And I want to, at the outset, introduce something to you. I will elaborate on this as we get to it. But I mean to dispel a notion that a lot of people have regarding the Levitical system and the old law. Someone said, well, redemption. I agree with that. I think that's the truth. It's what he's talking about, the perfection or the completion of salvation. If that were possible through the Levites, why would we need Jesus after the order of Melchizedek? Because the Levites came through the law and brought with them the law. But the law was not able to bring you to salvation. Here's a common idea that people have. Let me ask you the question. Was there forgiveness under the old law? Be careful how you answer this, because this is one very common, unfortunate misunderstanding. Was there forgiveness under the old law?
In connection with Jesus Christ, absolutely.
Can,
Forgiveness in the sense that sins were covered, but they weren't cleared until Christ's death that went back.
Hebrews 9 and 10, we will elaborate on it, but I want to read something to you. Because can I suggest to you that the problem wasn't the forgiveness of sins? They had forgiveness of sins. Go to Leviticus in the 4th chapter. Just go there. I'm going to show you multiple episodes where this is accounted for. And then I'll explain that in a week or two. In Leviticus in the 4th chapter, he's talking about a number of offerings. One is for sin that is unrecognized. Another is for purposeful sin. And for instance, I'll cut to this. And he tells you, this is what you do with the sacrifice. You give the animal this way, and you take the blood, and you take the fat, and you take the organs, and you take the skin and everything. He disposes of in due course. And then he says in verse 20, thus he will do with the bull, as he did with the bull of the sin offering. so shall he do with this. And the priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven. You go a little further, you will see this again and again in this one chapter, discussing, for instance, the sin offering and the burnt offering. And he says in verse 26, he said, so the priest shall make atonement for him and for his sin, and he shall be forgiven. And you can go down to the very last sentence there. There are a number of other places that you can look at in this chapter, but he says in the last verse of this passage, he said, he shall make atonement for him for the sin which he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. Well, I ask you, was he forgiven or wasn't he forgiven? He was forgiven. The problem with the old law wasn't the forgiveness of sins. I know you think that maybe that those things did not occur. They did occur. The problem is the way that sin was forgiven, and that it never accounted for the cost of sin. That's the problem. But there's another problem which we will discuss right now. Hold your thought on that forgiveness thing. If you have a difference of opinion, that's okay. I understand that. But I want you to understand that the problem isn't that, for instance, Hebrews later says the blood of bulls and goats could never what? Take away sin. Doesn't mean that God didn't require the blood of bulls and goats for the forgiveness of sin. Just simply means it wasn't commensurate with the cost of sin. Jesus' blood was commensurate with the cost of sin. And I hear all kinds of nonsense about the rolling forward of sin. I don't even know where that came from. The rolling forward of sin. That on the Day of Atonement, everybody's sins come up just like Jacob Marley and the chains that he forged in life. And then they got to deal with that sin every year. It's like a big snowball of sin. That's not the problem. We will come to it. But rest your mind where we are now so that you can be prepared for that. All right. It's evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priest. Are you ready to go on to the next thing? All right, here we go. Hebrews 7, we're now at verse 15. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. The likeness, the similitude. Not that Jesus is the second in line in the priesthood of Melchizedek. Nobody is a priest like Jesus. Not Melchizedek, not Aaron, not any of the Levites, not any other priest of God. He is singularly, uniquely, Jesus our high priest. All right? Who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement. The old law stated that the priest would come from Levi, and that's the way it went. It went from Aaron to his son Eleazar, to his son, who was Eleazar's son? Let me think about that. Was it Abishua? And in succession thereon. All right? Not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent. That's not how Jesus became high priest. He didn't become priest because the law said he's a high priest. He didn't become priest because he succeeded in a line of other priests. That's not what happened. But by the power of an indestructible life, in the similitude of Melchizedek. As far as you know, Melchizedek never died. He did die. But you don't know when, and therefore, there's no record of his death, and just like Jesus, that priesthood continually is part of Melchizedek. Jesus' priesthood is continually a part of him. You're a witness. You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of the weakness and uselessness. That's the Levitical order of priesthood. It was set aside. For the law made nothing perfect. It never completed salvation. It never gave us what we needed, even at the hand of the high priest. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. God never said, I swear by myself, these men will be priests forever. God never said that. He set in place a law. He put human beings in an office. They lived, they died, the next one came. But there's something more problematic about this. There's something more problematic. It's not without an oath, for those who were formerly became priests were made such with an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death in continuing in office. Problem number one. Got to have a priest continuously. There's problem number one. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. In contradistinction, Jesus never dies. He's always available. He's always the same. Consequently, he's able to save those to the uttermost, those who draw near to God through him. Since he always lives to make intercession. Problem number two. For it was indeed fitting that he should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separate from sinners, exalted above the heavens. That's Jesus. No man could aspire to that. Those were sinful men, the Levitical high priest. Those were men who did wrong. They were not innocent. They weren't separated from sinners. They took tithes from their brothers. They were those people. Exalted above the heavens. No priest of the Levites ever could claim that. He has no need, like those priests, to offer sacrifices daily. Problem number three. What's the problem with the Levitical system of priesthood and sacrifices? When you sin, what happens with your sin? Well, it's simple. You go and you find a bull and you bring it to the tent of meeting and you find a priest and he executes that bull, and then you go out and then you sin again. Uh-oh. Here comes another bull and another, because every time you sin, it isn't covered by the previous bull, the previous offering. You got a problem, is what I'm saying. If you're anything like me, you got a big problem, because your sin is ever with you, correct? But not so with Jesus. He's the perfect, what? Sacrifice for any circumstance. Do you imagine that sometimes those men woke up, fought with the priest's wife, maybe came with a bad attitude, and then they give your sacrifice? Can you imagine if you selected a bull and you didn't notice that that bull was imperfect? You just gave an imperfect sacrifice. Can you imagine if you went to the priest and he said, that's 2 turtle doves, it's not this. But he's wrong. Is that possible? And so he says he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily for first for his own sin and then for the people, since he did this once and for all when he offered up himself. One time. We do things amiss, we miss the mark, and right here, at the very moment, our plea to Jesus is, intercede for us, forgive me. And it's the perfect priest with the perfect sacrifice, under any condition, instantly taken care of for faithful hearts, right? For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. That's part of the difference between the Levitical order and what we're talking about. But we'll pick up with this thing next week. Now, I want to show you one thing before we leave here. You need to familiarize yourself. Just take a moment, look at a sketch or whatever of the tabernacle, because it plays a big part in what comes next. And so we want you to be aware of it. Go home, look at the tabernacle. You don't have to be an expert at it. Doesn't take a lot. And that's where we're going to look next week. Thank you very much.